I think this will be interesting to our listeners, but it's certainly extremely interesting to me. I would love to hear more about the particulars of your diet and the sourcing of your food.
Okay. It's not completely stable. I see myself as perpetually within round two of those discussions,
Yeah.
basically, and sometimes being more constrained and restricted and eliminating more things, and sometimes not. Well, there are three cases where I think about things a lot: dairy, humane farmed beef, basically, and wild caught seafood, including both fish and animals like prawns. I think there are reasons to be concerned about all of those, and also reasons to think they're okay. Part of the background here is that I'm one of the people who I think just needs a high protein diet. I wrote something about this years ago, a blog post called Squashed by the Pyramid, where the idea is the traditional food pyramid, very carb heavy, squashed me at a certain point. My health was wrecked by those patterns of advice, and going to a high protein diet made a enormous difference to my health. But which protein? If we think about dairy, which is what a lot of people would do if they're making a move from veganism towards more protein, modern dairy farming is getting pretty unpleasant, and it's hard to make it economical and humane in the way that raising beef cattle can be made economically viable and humane. I think in general, and I was sent a paper about this a year or so ago by some correspondents in Europe. Dairy cows in modern industrialized farming probably have lower welfare than most other cows in other kinds of farming. So dairy, it has certain kinds of advantages that people recognize, I think, reasonably from a vegetarian point of view. And I don't eat tons of dairy. I'm a bit wary about dairy. Humanely farmed beef at the moment is a place, I eat a lot of it. There's a particular place in Sydney where I live, which is the kind of ethically most scrupulous butcher in Australia, probably, where I get everything, essentially. And I feel I feel good about eating their stuff. In the case of seafood, here I find myself less stable, partly because I've usually thought wild caught fish, right? The fish lives its life without our interference. It dies at our hands, but everyone dies. It's a reasonable option. There's a biologist, Cullen Brown from Australia, who I know a little bit, and we're often on panels together talking about farming, fishing, animal welfare questions. And when Cullen talks about the actual experiences of that the fish face at the hands of traditional trawling type fishing, it sounds so awful. He really thinks there are some special harms associated with the end of life that fish encounter in commercial fishing operations. And when you combine that with the fact that when you're eating fish, it's pretty much tends to be in the vicinity of, one or two or perhaps three meals per animal, whereas in the case of beef cattle especially, it's many, many hundreds. I find myself, I'm sort of turning away from, I used to eat quite a lot of fish and now less and less. So there's a little bit of a narrowing towards what I think of as the most defensible kinds of farmed meat, humanely farmed beef. And I eat a lot of that at the moment. So I have a high protein diet because if I don't, I feel like I'm going to fall apart. With a lot of navigating through the ethical side in a somewhat quirky way. I talked about why I think eating lamb is not a great idea. I think beef is different. Cullen Brown and our radio appearances have got me wide-eyed at what happens with many kinds of fishing. And dairy, I think, the only good thing you can say about modern dairy is an extraordinary amount of food is produced by each cow in a modern dairy setting. It's vast amounts. So not that many animals have to suffer, for a person to eat dairy all the time. But I currently think of that as a less good reason to eat that food than the life worth living that the cows have in the humane farming operations case. And there's one dairy that Singer actually mentions in the most recent edition of Animal Liberation, the book called Animal Liberation Now, in Australia, where it seems ethically just 100% as good as you could make it. But trying to get that to be economic is much harder than it is in the case of beef cattle.